Let's go and get started. This is, again, this chapter is a very big chapter, and I lectured out of sequence the way the chapter is written, which, I don't know, maybe I'll have to fix that for upcoming semesters. But for this semester, we're going to start now where the chapter starts, and that's about medicine. And I've done this in the lecture a little bit afterwards, rather than before. Typically, I've lectured about this first and then come back to the other things. But a couple reasons why I've saved this. It does give us the historical perspective about biology. It'll allow us to go back a little bit, but it also gives us a specific focus on biology that I think I wanted to wait for, and that's really on disease and how our bodies interact with our environments in a way that maintains homeostasis, which is a term that describes our body's balance and the ability to stay balanced. So you eat food, for instance, to maintain a homeostasis of energy so that you don't get too much energy or too little energy. You just keep your cells going at an even keel. That's the whole goal of getting the food that you need, the nutrients that you need, to make sure your cells are maintaining this balance. So a lot of what medicine is about is what happens when this balance gets out of whack, right? Your body is out of balance. Either a disease organism has invaded and is causing your cells to have trouble. A virus may be using the cells to replicate new copies of the virus, and so your cells aren't functioning normally. Or just in certain parts of your body, you may have an infection that is making it difficult for those cells to function. There's swelling or whatever else that may be involved. So there's also much more extreme medicine that have to do with injuries, first aid, heart attacks, all kinds of things that we can talk about that we consider in the realm of medicine. If you recall from the beginning of the semester, I emphasized too that medicine, in its practice, the practice of medicine is not science. The discoveries that are behind our knowledge of our bodies and how we interact with the environment, that was discovered through science. But the application of that knowledge by a physician is different. Right? They don't form hypotheses about what's making you sick. They may have to guess a little bit, but it's not a hypothesis because it's not if it's a virus, then this will cure you. Let's set up an experiment and see, right? It's the most likely thing that's making you sick, given the symptoms that you're displaying, is a virus. And since we can't give antibiotics for a virus, just go home and rest for a couple weeks and you'll be fine. Or in the past, maybe they'd give you, I think it's a virus, but I'm going to give you an antibiotic just in case, or so your body doesn't get a secondary infection, something like that. But you don't want to wait for an experiment to be done about your health. You want to go ahead and get the best estimate that a doctor can provide you. Well, let's look at the history of medicine a little bit, because this brings up a lot of other interesting topics in our current day. We really are living in a period of time in which medicine is almost miraculous. I mean, it really is. We expect the doctor to cure us. We go to a doctor, we expect them to be able to figure out what we have and to fix it. That's very recent. We have not lived with that expectation for very long. And I'm talking about less than a century that we've really been able to have that kind of realistic expectation. That doesn't mean that we haven't had some effective treatments in the past, and that a lot of what we know today has been traditional wisdom in the past. But we have to be a little bit careful to separate traditional wisdom that was sort of real from traditional wisdom that was based on misconception and is a logical fallacy to rely on. Okay, in logic, there's a term called traditional wisdom, and it's a fallacy to rely solely on what people thought was true in the past. As we've seen from the very beginning, that's quite often not accurate, even though that's what we've believed for a long time. So there's still a lot of these kinds of issues hanging around today. Some people have a healthy skepticism and are able to look at traditional approaches and find some things that can work in balance with modern medicine, and others tend to get overboard a little bit. Yes?
What's the traditional history of antibiotics? Now what they're saying is that they're not, they're bad for our health. I can't
Yeah.
You know what I'm trying to...
Yeah, we're going to talk a lot about antibiotics. Now, again, in the traditional sense, there are some natural substances that can act as an antibiotic. So there were some poultices, those kinds of things, that you could put on a wound and it would help a wound heal because it had some antibiotic properties to it. But what you're talking about is actually a fairly recent phenomena. Again, the discovery of penicillin was miraculous. All of a sudden, we have a drug that can absolutely kill bacteria. Any infection that you have because of a bacteria, whether it's infection or a cold, I mean not a cold, but an intestinal illness, whatever it might be, can be cured. I mean, it was amazing. What we didn't realize right away, and maybe we should have a little bit sooner, was that the bacteria that we're attacking with the antibiotic evolve, and they've evolved. And so what we've done by two things, overusing antibiotics and misusing antibiotics over the years, is we've bred antibiotic-resistant bacteria. So antibiotics are less useful than they used to be. Okay, now where that becomes a danger is when you overuse them. So you're basically breeding antibacterial-resistant bacteria in your body or in your kitchen because you just overuse if it's 99.99% effective, well, that means 100,000 out of a million bacteria survive. And bacteria occur in those kinds of numbers. So even a 99.99% effective treatment is not going to kill all the bacteria, and the ones that survive are less likely to be killed by the next treatment.
How can you eat some bacteria?
We have to have bacteria. We'll get to that too. Our own microbiome is something I think that's where we'll go. This is just my opinion in the next 10 to 20 years to replace antibiotics. Is actually into our own microbiome and the ecology of bacteria that naturally exist in our bodies. So we'll talk a little bit more about that too. So I'm glad you brought all that up. You had your hand up.
Like in the case of people that are allergic to penicillin,
right?
They have other alternatives. What's the difference? Like,
well, they're all considered antibiotics, but there are some molecular differences. The psyllins, right, all are basically similar to penicillin. They have the same molecular structure, but there are a lot of different varieties. And so some of them are more effective for some things than others. There's also tetracyclines and sulfur-based antibiotics that work differently than penicillin. And so if you're allergic to penicillin, you might be able to use some of the others. And so a doctor may, again, there's usually this antibiotic is the most effective general antibiotic. I don't know specifically what it is, so I'm going to give you this general one. And it's usually a penicillin derivative of some sort, right? Amoxicillin or something like that. If that doesn't work, then they'll try the next most effective. And so there's sort of a hierarchy of those things too. But as we go forward, doctors are going to be able to, for instance, look at your own genome and prescribe things specifically for you, knowing that you might have an intolerance of one or the other, something like that. So again, we'll talk a little bit more about the pharmacogenetics movement a little bit too. Have your hand up in the back, or?
There's a lot of talk about there's here that the hand sanitizers and all these things that we use now, especially for
right.
kids and whatnot, is actually having a reverse effect to some degree.
That's right.
Where we're not building up any kind of immunity to things now. So
that's right.
That our bodies used to be able to naturally fight against. We're kind of actually defeating
that's right.
Limiting what our body is able to protect us against.
Yeah, there's a legitimate concern, and it's how well established this is debatable, but it seems pretty obvious that we are doing two things. One, we're breeding bad bacteria, but we're also not allowing our immune systems to develop their own resistance by continually treating our kids with antibiotics and not allowing their bodies to fight things off. Now, that's a tough call, right? I mean, if you're a parent and your kid's sick, most of the time it's probably the body will get it around, it will be able to recognize what it is eventually and get rid of that. But there are some scary things, so you don't want to take a chance. So it's been a difficult, and it still is, a difficult call for parents and doctors to make. But yes, that's one of the concerns, is that we're not challenging our immune systems enough. And that's one reason why, as we grow up, we have more allergies and more conditions that are due to autoimmune problems and things like that. Yes?
Although, doctors still need or do recommend, for especially for people with autoimmune
Right.
disorders, to use the antibacterial stuff. And so I think it really just, before we dismiss it and say it's all bad or it's all good, it really just depends on an individual's circumstance.
Exactly, and we never want to say anything's all bad or all good, right? We want to find the balance, we want to find the right approach. These are issues that we need to consider, again, as a society. I do tend to personally believe in challenging my immune system a little bit and making sure that it's capable of handling it, things like, and I have an autoimmune disease, so there's a lot going on. It's a very, very extremely complicated balance that we need to find. My personal recommendation would be, though, if you need to wash your hands, use soap. You don't need antibacterial soaps every time you wash your hands. Same thing in the kitchen. If you're cleaning the countertops, you don't need an antibacterial cleanser every time, simply because you're breeding bacteria that way. Yes.
But it was said not too long ago also about the sanitizer cream. It was not as effective as they say. 99%
right.
is not even as effective. It's better to wash your hand
with just soap. Yeah. There's a lot of things too about bacteria, right? There are good bacteria, there are bad bacteria. How likely are you to encounter bad bacteria that can really make you sick? These are primarily the coliform bacteria that come from feces, come out of your body in feces and then can get on other things. You may worry about somebody sneezing or coughing and the bacteria ending up on a door handle or something like that. You can swab any surface in this room or anywhere else and you'll be able to get bacteria off of it. Are they bad bacteria? Are they dangerous bacteria? Yeah, some of them will be. Are they bacteria your body can't deal with? Probably not. Most of the time, your body can deal with these things. Now, occasionally, your body gets imbalanced and you get, like if you get E. coli, which is normal, naturally occurring in your stomach, but if you get it back through your food, it can really get out, it can grow out of hand, and then you can get really, really sick and even die from that kind of infection. So again, it's a very complicated ecology. I'm going to use that term for bacteria. As an ecologist, this is an attractive idea to me, but there is a bacterial ecology in our bodies and surrounding us that is normally in balance, and when it gets out of balance, that's when we have problems. And that's what we're probably doing sometimes when we're using these cleansers, because you're right, there's two things going on. One, they're claiming 99.99%, but it may only be 96%. Two, it was probably 99.99% when they first tested it, but now that it's been overused, it may be less because the bacteria are resistant. So it may be down to 50% or something like that. And it's when you keep using those same products over and over again that you're just making the bacteria more and more resistant. Now, the scariest aspect of this, of course, are not only the antibacterial resistant bacteria, but those antibacterial resistant bacteria that are flesh-eating bacteria that we're seeing more and more of in hospitals and in the environment. Because those are pretty scary bacteria. Yes?
I guess I've heard the flu shot that they do every year. That's the big push to get every year, the flu vaccine.
Right.
I'm 43. I've never had a flu shot that I can remember outside of maybe as a child.
Right.
You get a cold, you deal with it. But it seems like, kind of like the same thing, though. It seems like you go back to overuse where you're inoculating everybody.
It's not, though. Viruses are a completely different thing. The reason you have to get a different flu vaccine every year is because flu is a group of viruses. It's not a single virus. It's just like cold viruses. There's not a cold virus. There's a bunch of them. And the flu viruses that might come up year to year can vary, and they change. They do evolve. But when you get a vaccine, you're basically telling your body, defend yourself against this virus. It's not an antibacterial. It's not artificially killing viruses in your body. It's actually pseudo-infecting you so that your body says, oh, I see that virus, I'm going to produce antibodies against it. The next time I see it, it won't hurt me. So you're strengthening your immune system with vaccines, whereas you're somewhat weakening your immune system with antibacterial antibiotics.
With the flu.
What's that?
Right, the injection is the antibodies of flu, right?
Say that one more
The
time.
flu injection that they give you, they're injecting the...
No, it's not the antibodies that they're injecting you with. It's actually a form of the virus that's been damaged. It's been damaged enough that it won't make you sick, but not so much that your body won't see it and recognize it. And say, that's a virus, I'm going to produce antibodies against it. So it stimulates your body to produce the antibodies against that virus. Yes?
Now, I think too the trick with some of the non-antibacterial, hand soaps and sanitizers is that people have to, some people say, oh, scrubbing your hands does more good than, cleansing with antibacterial stuff. Well, not everybody wants to take the time to scrub their hands.
Well, that's a good point.
I know, I don't,
Right.
sometimes I'm in a hurry. And so.
That's a good point. I mean, when we say washing your hands with soap, that does mean, what is the thing? Like count to, or say the alphabet twice or 3 times, something. I mean, you really need to be scrubbing, doing a good job.
For convenience, but the sanitizer would be helpful when you don't have access to soap and water.
Right.
But when it's accessible, soap and water would be the best option.
It's, and again, this is why it's never so simple, right? But ideally, I don't know, we could come up with guidelines. That's what government agencies do. They come up with guidelines. And then we all have to work, understand those guidelines are meant to meet the sort of standard deviation of the mean type of thing. There are going to be situations outside of that. There always are. I mean, this is part of the healthy skepticism. You always have to take any kind of medical advice you get, any kind of statements about this kind of thing, and understand just how complicated a system it is, not only for a society of people that vary, and every one of us react to things differently, but even within your own body, how complicated the reactions are in your own body to the foods you eat, to the medicines you take, to everything else, and how one thing may work one way one time, and the next time it's something different, right? We all have allergies as kids that we don't have as adults, and vice versa, because the body is literally reacting differently to these stimuli as we go forward. So let me get back a little bit. Let me just walk through, though, some of the transitions that have taken place in medicine from our traditional, sort of our traditional wisdom that we can see in almost every ancient culture where there's been some knowledge of things in the natural environment that can provide therapeutic benefits. But there's also a lot of things that were dangerous. And this really got focused, I think, as modern medicine started to emerge in the Middle Ages, because we did some really silly things. Now again, I don't go back and say those people were stupid. They did the best they could with the knowledge at the time, but this is the whole point of our scientific revolution. We can look at those practices with better, a better lens and see why they didn't work. Why did bloodletting not work? Right? Because it isn't demons in our blood making us sick, it's bacteria and viruses. So as we learned more and more, we stopped using leeches. Now we're using them again. But anyway, we know what we're doing with them now. We're not just trying to bleed you dry to get rid of whatever was making you sick. This is the big insight that led to modern medicine, and that is what's called cell theory. As we realize that your body is made up of billions, millions of individual cells, and that each cell has its own mechanisms for functioning that can be affected by disease organisms or anything else. So cell theory, if you wanted to state a law of biology, and biology doesn't typically have laws like physics does, where the same. If you drop something, the law of gravity works the same way every time. That's why it's called a law. But biology is too complicated. We're too complicated. Organisms are too complex to really have laws. There's hardly anything that's always going to happen. But this is pretty close. All living things are composed of cells. Some of this has to do with what we define as living, because a virus isn't a cell. So is a virus a living organism? Well, we can discuss that. It does do some of the things a living organism does, but it also lacks some of the things we would define as being living organism. But other than that, every living organism, from a bacteria to ourselves, are made of cells. Maybe just one cell, but it's a cell. The cell is the fundamental unit of life. Right? Single-celled organisms are organisms. We don't call a virus an organism. It has some properties of life, but it isn't always acting like a living organism. And last, all cells arise from previous cells. In our own development, of course, there are germ cells, the sperm and the egg, which combine to form a zygote, a single-celled zygote, which then starts to divide into the 2, 4, 8, 16, eventually blastula, gastrula, so on, right? Even bacteria, though, one cell splits into 2 cells. I mean, all cells arise from previous cells. They don't spontaneously generate. Now, there's a little bit of historical aspect to the term I just used that I don't have time to really go into. But before we understood cell theory, biologists were at a loss for how new organisms appeared. It looked like, for instance, that frogs just spontaneously generated in the pond. They couldn't find the intermediate stages right away. They couldn't see that a tadpole becomes a pollywog, becomes a frog. Just all of a sudden there are frogs. So this idea of spontaneous generation was a legitimate hypothesis for a while. It was easily proven false. But that's again how science works. By proposing that, it could be studied and shown to be false. And so now we know better. And that's part of the stuff that led to this understanding of cell theory. And I put the name Schleiden and Schwann because they're the ones who really stated these three, but Hooke was the first one to see cells under a microscope. They were dead cells, cork cells, but it again led to the recognition that all living things are made of cells. I've got Leeuwenhoek at the top, of course, first one to see living organisms in the microscope, his animalcules. We've known this, for quite a while. Now, there'll be a few slides that I won't have time to get to. There's information in the book, obviously, about cells, about how cells work, about how cells, what the components of cells are, animal cells and plant cells, and how they differ. And again, most of you have covered all this in high school biology classes. I won't go back and cover all of that because I don't have time, but there is that information in the book. What I want to focus on a little bit at this point is, again, disease and a couple other trends in biology that are a result of this, because really, in a lot of ways, this is one of the things that has led to scientific discoveries, is our need to understand and respond to disease. There are a number of things worth talking about, and when we talk about disease, we need to talk about immunity. This book up here, The Lives of a Cell, is worth looking for if you're interested in knowing more about the history of medicine, because the author, Lewis Thomas, was a doctor who started his practice in the early 20th century and continued pretty much through the 20th century. He's retired now. But he grew or learned medicine through this revolution, from a point at which you went to the hospital and most of the time you were going to die, to you go to the hospital and most of the time now you're going to survive. Even some pretty horrendous things. Again, we expect to be cured. And even more and more with cancers and so on. We're finding more and more cures. We're expecting more and more to survive rather than to die. I have an uncle-in-law who's, I shake my head at a little bit. He's a little older than me, overweight. He's had 2 or 3 heart attacks. Eats horribly, drinks, right, and has had the coronary bypass surgery that has basically replaced the coronary arteries so that he can survive. And his philosophy is basically, I don't need to change the way I live, because if my heart gets clogged up again, I'll just go back and it'll give me a new valve. Right? I mean, medicine's at a point now where there's a problem, fix it. And I shake my head a little bit because it's really like playing Russian roulette. I mean, there really are still cases where heart attacks are fatal, right? But not as much so as there used to be. Not so often as there used to be are strokes fatal. Not so often as they used to be are, we just did CPR training in the department last week. And, the methods and having defibrillators throughout the building. We have 20 of those units in the building. So your odds of surviving a heart attack in this building are a lot better than they were 10 years ago or 20 years ago, and so on. So we're continuing to grow. This is it's still one of the fastest growing fields in all of science, because more money is spent on this probably than any other branch of science. to find new cures and new treatments and to attack disease and allow us to live longer. And so we'll continue this discussion on Thursday with a discussion about longevity. If we look at our life histories, not too long ago, I would have been an extremely old man, right? Most people didn't live past 40 until the 19th century, until modern medicine really started kicking in. And in my lifetime, the life expectancy has gone from the mid-60s to close to 80 for my generation. So we have expanded our life expectancies continually for quite a while. Now that's seems to maybe be slowing down a little bit, but we've done this through medicine. We're not eating better, right? We're not eating healthier diets. And we can see all kinds of medical complications because of that, though we're not exposed to disease as much either. We're not getting worms. We're not getting other parasites in our systems from the food we eat. So even though we're eating too much fatty foods and too much sugar and added sugar, at least it's safe in that regard. Our food is not making us, is not infecting us. It is making us sick perhaps, but it's not like it used to be. You know, you could eat bad rancid food and it would kill you. Now, at least most of the time, we have pretty good protections on that. Again, not always, it still happens. What's that show on TV, The Monsters Within Us or something like that? I mean, you watch that show and you realize what's interesting to me about that, those things do still happen. And so you can see cases of intestinal worms and you can see cases of E. coli in spinach and things like that. Those things do still happen, but those things used to happen a lot. I mean, it used to be one of the major causes of death prior to modern medicine, were those kinds of toxic organisms and infections. So now it's rare. Now it's a TV show that everyone grimaces at. Goes, ooh, that's horrible, right? Because it is. It's horrible. And I don't mean to make light of it, but I do want to point out the advances that we've made. Because oftentimes it's easy to get swept up in an attitude of, you know, why can't they do this? And they've been working on this for so long. How come they don't have an answer yet? Instead of keeping that in perspective. And some things are harder to do than others. Some viruses are harder to produce a vaccine for than others. Some viruses are harder to isolate and track epidemiologically where they began and how to isolate. And right now is a pretty good time to think about this because of the Ebola scare right now. And so we may have a chance to come back to that. Let me go through, though, the types of immune responses. There's really, I probably mentioned some of this. You have an immune response that has many layers. Your primary defense is your skin and the mucous linings of your intestinal, from your mouth through your intestinal system, your nose. The reason you get all stuffy and have to blow your nose all the time is because the cilia in your nose, the mucus is being produced to trap things before they get into your bodies. All right, that's your first line of defense. If something does get into your body, it gets absorbed into the bloodstream, then your blood has an immune response, and that's what we've been talking about with antibodies, where your blood can recognize that shouldn't be here, that's not part of me. Let's attach to this and mark it, and then there are other cells that come along and destroy it. These white blood cells, various types, that some recognize a foreign agent and others destroy it. So if you take a vaccine, you're training your body to recognize something that it might encounter. Because if you take a vaccine for a flu virus, the flu's all over the place. What makes flu so common is how easily transmitted it is. It can stay viable in the air and on surfaces. So we're all constantly exposed to flu viruses all the time. They're easy to get. So your body really has to be able to respond to them. Ebola, on the other hand, is very difficult to get. Now, it's scarier if you get it, right? You don't expect the flu to kill you, even though the worst epidemic in human history was a flu epidemic. Killed more people than any other disease organism. Today, we think of flu almost like a cold, like, oh, I got the flu. Oh, well, you know, I'll live through it. Ebola, on the other hand, if you were to go to the doctor and said, oh, I think you have Ebola, you would freak out because you would expect to die. I mean, it's 70-some% mortality rate. It used to be worse, but it's, anyway. It's a pretty bad, I mean, it's a really bad virus. The thing is, you're not very likely to get it because you have to come in direct contact with bodily fluids. Now, that's similar to HIV or what's the other, hepatitis, some of these other viruses that are transmitted only through bodily fluids. What makes Ebola scarier than those, even though it's hard to be much scarier than HIV, we'll get back to that in a second. But Ebola is scary because it makes your body excrete fluids, right? I mean, it makes you ooze, you know, you bleed from all kinds of places, you throw up, you're sick. I mean, it's just, it makes you pretty dangerous once you have it. So we have to recognize it, you have to follow protocols. They did not follow proper protocols in Dallas. There were a lot of mistakes made. And so again, we can talk about this more in lab if you'd like to. But it's really not something to worry too much about, so long as you don't come in contact with somebody who's you know, like bleeding through their eyes or something like that. Anyway.
Why don't we get why are we educated to get the meningitis shots until we get to college?
Meningitis is a very dangerous virus, for one thing. It can lead to paralysis and to a lot of other problems. And so because of the severity of the disease and the fact that, if you think about this when you were in preschool or kindergarten. How often did kids get sick and go home? Well, it used to be a lot, right? I remember being in kindergarten one day and it was just like one at a time. Kids were throwing up and going home. It ended up like 2 or 3 of us were left in the classroom. That's how things get spread around when you're in groups. And that used to be, when I was a kid, how we got exposed to things and our bodies built up that defense. Now, that one kid that gets sick goes to the doctor, gets an antibiotic, stays out a day or two, and it doesn't infect the whole classroom. But similar to that scenario, though, where it still does happen more often in kindergartens, where you probably got sick more often when you were little than you do now. Well, meningitis, similarly, is more likely to be spread once you are in a group, again, in college. And some of the behaviors that you partake in college make you more susceptible to that. I won't go into too much more detail on that. But, so this is where the front lines are, essentially, is in college. We can stop it if we can get everyone vaccinated before they go to college, or at least cut down really, really big. So it got to a point where it was a big enough public health problem that they passed that regulation that anyone going to college now has to have that vaccine so that we can stop the spread of that. Yes?
Dr. Hope, I heard that the Ebola virus was a manufactured virus, and the United States had a patent on it in 2012.
Yeah.
They got a patent on it. They're on the patent with some other.
Well, all right. It's not a manufactured virus to begin with. Now, in the patent, there are strains.
Research patent.
Right. So there are strains that are kept in labs, like in Galveston, we have a Tier 4 lab that can do research on those kinds of organisms.
Right.
But that's not how the virus became danger. It did come from an animal source, probably bats. We're not confident, I'm not completely sure of that because, again, the epidemiology traces it to a cave in Africa where there are a lot of bats, but it can't directly be connected. Anyway, so like a lot of viruses that normally infect other animals, they can change enough to then become infectious to people, to humans, and that's what happened with Ebola. Same thing with HIV. The conspiracy theories on HIV are a little bit more, well, the fact that there might have been something to, they came from monkeys. The experiments of when we developed the polio vaccine using monkeys as test subjects might have been part of how the HIV virus got into the human population. And it was inadvertent, but there's some connection that may be true. Polio and smallpox are the two biggest success stories. It used to kill more people than any other virus, and now you don't worry about smallpox or polio anymore, right? You get vaccinated. there's even been a little bit of a resurgence in smallpox because people were so not afraid of it, you don't get vaccinated anymore. So why don't you get vaccinated for smallpox? There's no smallpox anymore. And there isn't in the U.S., but there are other parts of the world where it's starting to actually come back a little bit. And so go, whoa, wait a minute, don't stop taking your smallpox vaccines. Polio is similar, we still get vaccinated for polio because it's still around, but no one, it's very, very, I don't think anyone in the United States has had polio in quite a while. And that's how successful vaccines can be. There's nothing an antibiotic treats that's gone, right? But there is almost completely eradicated the smallpox virus. But anyway, getting back to the Ebola question, there's an interesting, it's a very scary virus. I was going to lead to HIV. The thing that makes HIV scarier is that it doesn't show symptoms for a long time. Whereas Ebola, you get Ebola within a couple days, you have Ebola. You're already showing some very severe symptoms. So it's fairly easy to recognize and isolate, quarantine essentially once you've found it. Not to say that it's still not tragic, it's still going to kill quite a few people, but in terms of a large population, the people exposed can be identified and isolated if protocols are followed properly and so on. But with HIV, you can't do that because it could be years from the time you're infected with the virus to the time you actually show any symptoms and have it recognized. And so it sits sort of not dormant, but kind of dormant, can sit there for a long time and then be triggered into being active by something later on. And you can carry that virus in your system without symptoms for a long time. Now, we don't have a vaccine. There are some still being in trials, but we have enough treatments for it now that most people expect to survive with HIV infection. It's not cheap, but in this country you expect to survive because you expect to get your drugs. In other countries, there's not enough of those to go around. Yes, in the back.
Silly, but I just want to ask.
Uh-huh.
You can't get that from mosquitoes.
No, you have to have, and that's a good question. When HIV first came out, I remember, there was a lot of fear about it. And my wife and I were volunteering at an organization that was helping kids that were HIV positive. And at the time, people were like, "Are you crazy?" You get it from their tears. You can get it from changing their diapers. You can get it, all these ways. And I was a biologist, so I was like, I'm not so. It's not that easy. But people were legitimately, well, how about mosquitoes, right? If it's blood to blood, a mosquito's taking blood from one person, taking it to another. But it gets broken down by the enzymes in the mosquitoes, proboscis, very quickly, and it doesn't survive that transition. But that had to be tested, right? That had to be looked at and tested. Most of those kids that were HIV positive never ended up developing full-blown AIDS because the antibodies were what were testing positive. They had the antibodies because their mothers had HIV. And so the antibodies were in their blood, but they didn't actually get the virus. Now, some of them did. Some of them developed full-blown AIDS, but not all of them. So there's a big learning curve with any of these viruses. Because the expectation at the time was that they would all eventually develop that. And I just bring this up again because to talk about something historically, and we can look back in time and we're in the midst of history, right? We always are, but even so, more so with medicine, because we're learning every day, and we have new challenges every day, right? Ebola hasn't been around that long, and it won't be the last new virus. We need to learn how to respond to these things, and we are learning how to do it. Let me get back real quickly again. The immune response is what we typically think of. There are two ways that the immune response can sort of go awry. One is what's called autoimmunity, where the body is attacking its own cells as if they were foreign agents. This can happen in specific tissues or in general systems. It can lead to any number of disorders, from some fairly benign like mine to some life-threatening ones, multiple sclerosis and diabetes and on and on and on, lupus, scleroderma. There are a lot of autoimmune diseases where the body is basically attacking itself. Now, there may be an environmental stimuli that triggers it or exacerbates it, makes it worse, but it's really an autoimmune problem. It's your body attacking its own cells. Allergies are different in that your body is overreacting to an environmental stimulus. So pollen, for instance, pine pollen. Pine pollen will not make you sick, but your body still defends itself against it very vigorously by causing the tissues in your air passages to swell up, by causing you to excrete, again, more and more mucus to try to flush it out. And so that's an allergic response. Allergic responses can be serious, right, severe. Closing up the throat, if you have a peanut allergy or an allergy to bee stings or something like that. So it is a malfunction of the immune response, but it's a response to natural things, not to your own body. So if somebody, like I get this all the time, and I pretty much just, are you allergic to gluten? No, I'm not allergic to gluten. I'm insensitive to gluten. I have an autoimmune response that is triggered by the presence of gluten, but it's actually my immune system attacking the microvilli of my intestines, and that's what causes the disease. If they want to call it out, if the person at the counter, and I'm asking, do you have a gluten-free menu, if they want to think it's an allergy, that's fine. Again, the distinction isn't really worth making in public, but it's worth making in the classroom. Does that make sense? If you're lactose intolerant, you're not allergic to milk, you're intolerant. You can also be allergic to wheat or gluten, but that's a different response. And so again, in practice, it may not matter which it is, but personally it would matter to you because it would depend on how you need to react, or how you need to treat that. If you have an allergy, you typically respond very quickly. You have an attack of something, the pollen, or to say you're allergic to peanuts, you eat a peanut, it doesn't take you very long to react to that. Matter of fact, it can be very quick, and that's what makes it dangerous. With my intolerance and other intolerances, I don't know for 3 days because it takes that long for the microvilli to sort of shrivel up, and then I feel bad. So it's not an immediate reaction. And that's why it's important sometimes to just sort of be able to ferret out some of these differences. And if almost everyone has something that you're intolerant to some level. It doesn't have to be extreme. It could be mild. It could be soy. It could be wheat. It could be corn. It could be fish. It could be, whatever. We also all have allergies. Some things that we're allergic to. And again, it could be shellfish. Could be pollen, grass pollen, whatever. This time of year, it's probably ragweed. How many people have been sniffling a lot and being stuffy and not feeling great in the last month or so? If you have been, that's probably ragweed. It's one of the more common allergies. So these are all different things. And then the last thing on this list, carcinogens and other toxins. Toxins are different than infectious agents. These are poisons, chemicals that can damage your cells. It's not an organism, though it's usually produced by an organism. So botulism, for instance, is a toxin produced by a bacteria. And so if you have a can of food and it's puffed up, I wouldn't eat it, right? Because it could very easily have botulism in there. But the toxin is not the organism. It's produced by an organism. A bee sting, for instance, it's a toxin. Or a snake bite, that's a toxin. They can be neurotoxin or muscular, different things. And then carcinogens are similar, except that they're causing mistakes to be made in the DNA of your cells so that your cells aren't working properly. Again, these are usually environmental factors, but they can also be viruses, or an infection can actually trigger that kind of damage. So cancer and carcinogens and toxins and all these other things are other things that we need to worry about. So you get antitoxins, or when you get chemotherapy for cancers, they do different things, but they are trying to isolate those cells that are not functioning properly. All right, so let's see. Another big step in medicine was anesthesia and sterile instruments. Sterile instruments, really big deal, right? Before we knew about germs, why wash the scalpel? Right? You're out in the field, Civil War, and a guy's had his leg blown off. He's going to bleed to death if you don't do something. All right, bite down on this belt, and I'm going to cut your leg off with this saw, and we're going to put a tourniquet on it, and you'll survive. You'll lose your leg, but you'll survive. Well, the infection rate was horrendous because you'd cut one guy's leg off and you'd go to the next guy. And so you were transmitting disease. Well, once, of course, people realized, whoa, wait a minute, there's this idea over here called cell theory and disease theory that has been developed by Pasteur and Koch and these others. We probably need to wash those saws in between people. And it increased the survivability rate tremendously. I mean, tenfold. Just by using sterile instruments. The other one, of course, biting down on a belt when you're having your leg sawed off makes most of us cringe, right? Or all of us cringe. I don't know anybody who wouldn't cringe at that. You'd much rather say, okay, just put me to sleep, then you can saw my leg off. Right? You have to have your leg sawed off. You've got flesh-eating bacteria. You want your leg sawed off so it doesn't spread to the rest of your body. Okay, but put me to sleep first. Right? So anesthesia is a big deal. Now you have to be careful with anesthesia. Any drug can be toxic at different levels. Any food almost can be toxic at different levels. So, but especially drugs. Things we consider drugs that are beneficial in some doses or in some situations but are toxic in other doses or other situations. And that's why we pay doctors lots of money, to know where that dose is. Right? Take this much Tylenol and it gets rid of your headache. Take this much Tylenol and it kills you. Where's that line? And it can vary, again, but we can look at the distribution of how people react to Tylenol and say this is the correct dose for most of us. Right? Don't take more than that. And with a lot of drugs, they'll have a certain dosage, and then as we learn more about it, it'll go away from having to be prescribed to being over the counter. Because it's not so dangerous. I mean, you can still kill yourself with over-the-counter medications if you don't follow the directions. But it's less likely to make a mistake than the drugs that are still being prescribed, because those have to be more carefully administered. Yes?
You know, I see these commercials every day. You get medicine for like this cartoon character.
Yeah.
Or
Right.
a prescription for arthritis, but prescription will cause you 50 other
Right.
symptoms, and you're trying to cure that one.
Right. Well, you do have to look at, and again, this is something that really is important to understand from this class, if there's anything else, is that when I talk about, you do the experiments and you get a distribution of reactions. You give this medication to some people and they die. Okay? You give this treatment to some people and they survive. Well, when I talk about standard deviations, what we're saying is that the mean in the middle, where it helps people and either kills some people, doesn't help anybody else. All right, those are the extremes. If most of the people fit within, say, 67% or 90% of that mean, and that's still safe, then that gets dosed accordingly. And you're not allowed to take it outside of that dosing range because that increases the chances of having a side effect. But there are going to be some people with those side effects even within that 90%. So you have to be warned about it so that if you start seeing that, you can get treatment for it. Every drug is going to have some side effects. These things are, you take something orally to get rid of your headache, it's not just going to your head, right? It doesn't know when you take it, oh, this is for a headache, I'm going to the head. It's getting to spread out throughout the body. And it just happens to also get to the head and cure your headache. That's true of almost any medication that you take orally. If you get it injected, you can get a little bit more of an immediate response in a local area, but it's still going into the bloodstream and going to go throughout the body. It's just going to get past the stomach lining and some of the, your stomach is digesting that medicine to a sense. It weakens the medicine quite a bit. So if you need something to be more effective, you need an injection. But it's still going into the bloodstream. You're still going to have side effects. You still need to be aware of all of these. Most of us just, we get our medicine from the doctor, we tear off that sheet of side effects, that long list of things that can happen, and we don't even look at it. Because we trust the doctor knows what they're doing, but every so often, it either doesn't really work for us, and we're going, that didn't work. Well, we were in that range where it isn't effective, or we end up getting reaction of some sort, and they can be somewhat dangerous. But again, that's why we have all those guidelines. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to just talk about one more thing, and then we're going to because I think I've talked enough about that. But I do want to mention this, and there's links here, so you might want to go look at it some more. But this is something that over the last few years, even as I've been teaching this course, we've become more and more aware of the importance of our microbiome. And the fact is, you have more bacteria in and on your body than you have cells. Okay? Every one of your cells is surrounded by more than one bacteria, multiple bacteria. Now, parts of your body have a higher concentration than others, but you have a lot of bacteria on your skin, you have a lot of bacteria in your gut, you have bacteria in almost every system of your body, or in every system of your body. And this chart sort of breaks down where they are. That's natural, that's normal. If you cleansed yourself of all that bacteria, you'd die, you wouldn't survive. You need them, you're symbiotic with them. The classic example is the E. coli in your stomach that helps you break down the food you eat. You have to have that bacteria in your stomach or you would not be able to survive. If that bacteria gets out of you through your feces and then back into your system, it can cause an imbalance and you can get sick. Same bacteria, out of balance is a problem. So when we talk about our microbiome, and we're starting to realize more and more, when we're attacking an imbalance with an antibiotic, it's sort of like bringing in the tanks to attack a small uprising, right? You're bringing in the heavy artillery every time. And you're doing as much damage to your overall microbiome as you are good, because you're killing not only the bad bacteria but the good bacteria. And most of the time we're healthy because our good bacteria are outcompeting the bad bacteria. They're keeping your body in balance. If we get all of that out of balance, we're more likely to get sick. So we're learning more and more about this. I think in the future we're going to be seeing more and more treatments of our good bacteria. You can take a probiotic now, but it's still usually only one or a few bacteria. As we understand more and more how all these interactions are taking place, we may be able to cure disease by promoting the good bacteria rather than attacking the bad bacteria. I don't know, we'll see. But it's an interesting topic that I think everybody should probably look into a little bit more to try to see. Now, the rest of these slides, again, are sort of the biology that I'm not going to talk about because we don't have time. You've talked about in high school the information. We have mentioned some of these things as we go in a couple points. But anyway, you can flip through them and you can see there's more information there, and there's certainly more information in the book. But I'm over time, a couple minutes. Let me get to the quiz. All right, I think the first quiz we run into, well, no, that's mismeasure, man. We did that one. We did genetics. No, this is longevity. Oh, here's medicine. All right, so here's the quiz we're going to take today. Your skin is the largest organ of your body. True or false? That's true. Your skin is an organ. I didn't talk a lot about cells are the basic components of things. Specialized cells form organs. Organs work in systems, organ systems. The skin, though, is an organ, just like your heart or your lungs or anything else. The skin is the largest organ in your body. Sort of an interesting little fact. Cell theory was developed by Louis Pasteur? No. Disease theory, he had a lot to do with that, but cell theory was Schleiden and Schwann.
That was false?
That was false. Many tissues have adaptations to increase surface area. This is true. Your intestines, your lungs, increased surface area allows you to digest the food you eat, to get all of the cells in your body, the food, nutrients and oxygen that they need, your circulatory system, and so on. So again, if you read through the chapter, you'll see more of this, but that's true. Many tissues have adaptations to increase surface area. All right, there are more bacteria in your body than your own cells. True. And did I click true or false? I don't know what I clicked. The gastrula stage comes before the blastula stage in human development. That's false. Blastula first, gastrula second. You can look back at that. All right, I think if I clicked everything correctly,
What was the last one?
last one was false. Blastula comes before gastrula.
False?
Yes, false. Last one was false. All right, sorry to hold you over a little bit. I'll see you guys in lab. Those of you who have lab today, have today, have today, have today, have today.